All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another live stream for the Hickory Street Church of Christ. Just to remind everybody, we do have a open Zoom meeting going on every time that we meet, and so feel free to get on your cell phone or your tablet or even your house phone. You can even call in to Zoom and put that ID in, and it'll take you right to our chat, so you can participate in the discussion, ask questions, make comments, or whatever it is that you need to do. Today, or rather this evening, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 22. We are studying the theme of sacrifice throughout the Bible, and we started in Genesis 3, and we went to Genesis 4 to talk about Cain and Abel, and we looked at Noah in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, and now finally we are in Genesis chapter 22 to talk about one of the most important events in Israel's history. In fact, I have a quote here that I want to share with you. This is from a author whose name is Tom Holland, and he is a author in the UK, and he has this to say about Isaac's sacrifice. He said that there are, according to the ancient rabbis, there are 4 key events affecting Israel. These are creation, the birth and sacrifice of Isaac, the Passover in Egypt, and the end of the age. So those 4 main events in Israel's history, we've already discussed 2 of them. Now, what's interesting is that the sacrifice of Isaac, according to tradition, took place on the same day as Passover would take place in about 400 years or so after this occurrence. So there's a lot of dates that sort of line up in Israel's history, Passover being one of the main ones. Who knows something else major that happened on Passover? Pretty significant event took place on Passover. Does anybody remember what that was?
Well,
That's right, the crucifixion of Jesus. And so you could, that one of those other events he said was key in Israel's history was the end of the age. And so you can say that, that happened on Passover as well, whenever Jesus was crucified, in a sense. Or I should say the beginning of the end of the age. And then, of course, there is, does anyone know when the fall of Jerusalem took place?
Ashley?
The year?
Yeah, the year, but also sort of the day.
Was it September? Oh, was it the 9th of August?
Right. Well, it was in the fall that the actual fall of the temple took place. I should have said the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem began around Passover in the spring of that year, and so there's a lot of dates that line up with Passover. Another interesting thing you might enjoy, a little tidbit for you, is that in Genesis 20 and 22 and verse 2, they go to the land of Moriah in order to offer up Isaac. Now, this could be just a coincidence in name, but there's one other place in the Bible that talks about the land of Moriah. And does anybody know where that could be? That's, according to 2 Chronicles 3 and verse 1, that's the location of the construction of the temple.
Oh,
Yeah.
What the Solomon built?
That Solomon built, that's right. And so there's a lot of interesting things in the scripture that have its root in Genesis chapter 22. In fact, many of the sayings concerning Jesus, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, he's the firstborn, and all these things come from this story of Abraham offering up Isaac. And of course, the death of the firstborn in the Passover event in the book of Exodus comes from this story of the binding of Isaac as well. And so this passage is very instrumental to our understanding of much of the Bible, and it's one of the main events in Israel's history. So let's go to Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1, and we're going to study through this passage all the way down to verse 19. So let's start here, Genesis 22, and begin in verse 1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Now, this detail that God tested Abraham is given to the reader, not to Abraham. We're sort of behind the scenes in this account. And the reason for that, of course, is because we know as soon as he tells Abraham what he has to do, that God has no intentions of Abraham actually offering up his son Isaac. That God does not support, in any way the child sacrifice sort of themes that existed in this time. In fact, there are texts and texts and and things found in archaeology from the Phoenician and Punic colonies like Carthage in North Africa that describe the ritual of child sacrifice as a means of ensuring continued fertility. That's from a book on the biblical background of the Bible. And so Abraham would have been familiar with this idea of offering up your firstborn to the gods of fertility to basically secure continued fertility so you can have more children. It sounds counterproductive to us, but this is the way that some of these ancient people thought. And so the Bible, though, is letting us in on the fact that this is a test, that God has no intentions of allowing Abraham to actually kill his son Isaac. In fact, that's one of the things that he says he despises throughout the prophets, later in Israel's history. In fact, one of the reasons why the Bible says that Israel was carried into Babylonian captivity is because of their offering up their sons, to Molech, causing their children to pass through the fire to Molech, right? And so we're getting the behind the scenes scoop here, right in verse 1. Abraham answers to God, and whenever God says Abraham, he says, Here I am. The word here is chenini, and he actually is going to say that a couple more times in this passage. But in this account, this is the only thing that Abraham says to God up until the time that he offers up Isaac. He says, Here I am, and he doesn't say anything else in the record that we have. And this illustrates the severity and the gravity of the situation, just how big of a deal this is. So God responds in verse 3, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. And so this is not a surprise to Abraham in terms of child sacrifice. He is familiar with that because of the time in which he lives. What is surprising to Abraham in this particular case is that Isaac was supposed to be the one through whom God would bless all the nations. Right? It would be through his seed that all nations of the world would be blessed. And Isaac is called the child of promise. So what would be confusing to Abraham would not be the prospect of child sacrifice. That was something that was common in the world, unfortunately. But it was the fact that God was asking him to offer up his only begotten son. To offer up the one through whom the promises would come. It seemed counterproductive to what God had told Abraham before. But one of the things that we have revealed to us in the book of Romans is that Abraham's faith was so strong in God that he believed that if he were to go through with sacrificing Isaac, that God would raise him from the dead. And so this is an account of great faith that Abraham had towards God and hope in his promises. Let's move on a little bit to verse 3. We read, So Abraham arose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood. It says he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Now notice that he travels for 3 days there in verse 3. That's a big deal, because if God told Abraham to offer up his son, one of the things that Abraham could do is say, okay, that's fine. Let's do it and do it right now. But what does making him travel for 3 days do? Anybody have a guess?
Agony.
What did you say?
Did he change his mind and
Yeah.
We couldn't really hear you that well, Miss Sutter. You said he could change his mind.
Yeah, Abraham. It could have gave Abraham just the chance to change his mind, or to just test his faith.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we could probably, if somebody makes a request to you, that might be difficult to do. It's a lot easier to do it in the moment when the emotions are high than 3 days later, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right.
And so this is really set up as a test for Abraham. And in verse 5, Abraham tells the young men, he says, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." So I think again, this is a testimony to Abraham's faith. In one sense, it could be that he's masking the purpose of their trip to Isaac. But as we learn in Romans chapter 4, Abraham knows good and well that God can raise Isaac from the dead if he needs to. And so he has no problem with with saying, "We will worship and return to you." That's how sure Abraham was of God's promises to him. Anybody have any comments on verses 1 through 5?
Yeah, one.
All right.
He was asking about Abraham on those days' journey that it took him to take Isaac to the place that he was going to offer him up. That left the whole time that he was going, it was in his heart. It was in his heart that was what he was going there to do, to sacrifice his son. And it's all like, recall the incident where Jesus said, if a person look at a woman with lust in his heart, he's already committed that act already.
Right.
So it was sort of like with Abraham. He already committed this act. When he got there, he had already committed it. So it really, and just like you said before, he knew that God had made that promise that, hey, through Isaac, he felt like he do it, God was going to raise him back up again.
Right, exactly. In fact, the sacrifice could have been considered made the second that Abraham said, "Here I am," and resolved within his heart to go. Because in because in James chapter 2 and verse 21, the scripture says, "Was Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar?" So James considered that the offering was indeed made, kind of like what you're saying, Johnny. He had so much determination to follow God's will that in God's eyes it had already been done, right? The knife had already made the kill, and the sacrifice had already been made. It just really shows how dedicated Abraham was. All right, anybody else have anything? We got some music going on somewhere.
Is there any parallel, would you say, today to, well, I guess it would be in the sense of, I'm thinking about the passage that Uncle Johnny just referenced about, if a man looks upon a woman with lust in his heart. So it's like, certain decisions that we make in life, or, choices that we make, or things that we dwell on. Like, some people get right to the door of doing a thing and they may not necessarily carry out the act, but they had it in their heart to do. It's kind of like the same principle, right?
Like, can you give me an example?
Like, I don't know, say you was thinking about cheating somebody out of their money or something.
Oh, right.
And that was the thing that you set out in your heart you was going to do it, and then right at the 11th hour, for whatever reason, you didn't go through with it, per se.
Right.
Would it?
I guess it would be, it would depend on why you didn't go through with it. If you didn't go through with it because, somebody stopped you or you got held up doing it or something like that, that's one thing.
Right.
But if you didn't go through with it because you realized it was wrong, I would think that would be a different thing. Johnny?
That's Paul said, "Godless sorrow works as repentance."
Right.
That was repenting. That person that changed their mind, no, I'm not going to do it. They realized that they were wrong, and hey, godless sorrow, they changed their mind. No, I'm not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it lines up more maybe with this example. This might be a better one. Is if let's say you purpose in your heart to go to worship on Sunday, right? And then your car breaks down on the way, right? So that seems more like the Genesis 22 story. Is that something that you were going to do, but an angel stopped your hand, so to speak, right? God, I don't think which I've got different opinions on worship and things like that, anyways. But I don't think God would hold that against somebody.
Right.
Here's probably even a more difficult example. Let's say somebody says that they want to be baptized, right? And they purpose within their heart to do that thing, and they die in a car crash on the way there, or something, an act of God, so to speak. Well, that's kind of bad language in this, but something extraordinary keeps them from getting to that baptistry. I think God's going to look at that person not according to what transpired, but according to what they had purposed in their heart, fully, totally to do. So I think that lines up more with Genesis 22. Abraham considered or rather, God considered the offering as if it had already been made, and I think that is, I think that's more to the point there. But yeah, those are good thoughts, everybody. All right, let's get back to Genesis chapter 22, and let's look at verse 6. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering. Hey, by the way, notice in verse 4 that he sees the place from afar off. He sees the place from a distance. So that adds to the stress and the anxiety, Like you've probably been driving down the road or something like that, and maybe going to a funeral, or going from the church to the gravesite or something like that, and you see that hill afar off, or you see that plain where the graves are afar off. That makes it more real than you imagining it on the way there, right? It adds something to it to see it there afar off. So this situation has become very real for Abraham now, and he takes the wood and the burnt offering, and he laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So two of them walked on together. It seems kind of odd that Abraham would make Isaac carry the wood, I think if I was in this situation, I probably would have carried the wood for Isaac,
Yeah, but Daniel, if you could see the two parallel there, is that Abraham, Abraham had confidence, and his thing is he was so full of God that he had the confidence that God was not going to bring him no harm, Isaac no harm. But you see, and also that Isaac even see that his father, he might have was taking him there, but he know that his father was not going to bring no harm on him either. So they both had confidence that nothing was really going to happen. But if it did happen, that God had a way of bringing them out of it.
Right.
Right.
Isaac hasn't. He's about to kind of figure it out in verse 7, but unfortunately, the Bible doesn't give us. You kind of wish you had Isaac's reaction. There were some ancient rabbis that theorized that Isaac knew what was going on and was a willing participant in the whole thing. But I think that's a good idea, but I don't know how much we can read into that. Here's one parallel though that I saw is that Abraham laying the burnt, having Isaac bear the wood is similar to Jesus bearing the cross.
Right.
Right.
What were you going to say, Johnny?
That was what I was going to say.
I gotcha.
Because this was a reference related to Abraham offering his only son and having him to carry the cross, and God gave us his son, and he had him to carry the cross.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
You can also see though this really makes the crucifixion real. How terrible it was for Abraham that Abraham had to go through this, and so the same thing could be said of God and Christ. It was not a joyous occasion, for Christ to have to suffer in the way that he did and be rejected in the way that he did. Now the outcome of it was joyous, but the whole process, as Jesus said, "Let this cup pass from me," and of course Jesus was God in the flesh, and so there is there's a lot of strong parallels between this and what we have in the gospel accounts. Okay, so let's see. They walk on together. And in verse 7, Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, son." There's that word chanini again, by the way. Just Abraham's always, ready to receive, ready to hear. He's always ready to listen. And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" See, he notices that something's up. Something's amiss. And Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. Again, I don't think Abraham is lying here. He knows that he knows that God is not going to allow Isaac to remain dead, and he knows that if a lamb needs to be offered, they'll find one. God will provide that for himself, and so there's just so much faith expressed on the part of Abraham in this passage. It really is just astounding. So go for it.
And also Isaac, even him being a child, it's just that much that he father that he wasn't going to allow any harm to come to him either. He didn't believe that his father would allow any harm that would come to him. But at the time, Isaac didn't know that he was going to be offered up as the lamb.
All right, yeah, he didn't know it just yet, but he's about to. So, and that's what we haven't. Oh, Johnny. Oh.
This is Bill.
Oh, hey, Bill.
Yeah, hey, I joined a little bit late. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
I don't have the video on right now, but can you hear me okay?
We can. Nobody has video on, so you're not alone.
All right. Well, I have a bit of a question. Well, first a comment. Isaac would have known perhaps that Esau, Abraham had said to Sarah, go ahead and send away your son and the woman, and sent them off in the desert basically to die. And it was the angel that rescued them. So in a sense, what Isaac, if he knew about that, what he knew was that the angel had rescued, even though Abraham and Isaac had committed their child to death and their wife to death or whatever. But what I really was going to ask about is, how James says that Abraham was justified by works.
Yes.
When he offered Isaac. And I know that in Paul's writings, he points out that Abraham was justified by believing.
Right.
And I was wondering if the account of Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness was then being described. In other words, the Genesis account really is describing this account of the offering of Isaac and introducing it with saying, this is the story of how Abraham was justified by faith, and then going on to tell about all that. Is that a possible way to read that?
Right. I think the way that James puts it is that in the offering up of Isaac, the scripture was fulfilled, which says that Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And so, righteousness was imputed to Abraham, 7 chapters earlier in Genesis chapter 15. But the saying that righteousness was counted to him was demonstrated in his action in Genesis 22, and I think that mirrors the experience that we have as Christians, is that righteousness is imputed. You know, that, you know, all that we do is we submit to God, and it's Him that raises us up, and then that saying is fulfilled whenever we go out and we live, and you know, we minister to people and teach the gospel, and you know, love our neighbor as ourselves. That in those actions are, you know, the saying righteousness or was imputed to them upon their faith is fulfilled. So Genesis 22 is the evidence that Abraham had faith. His actions, you know, is evidence that he had faith to begin with. Is the way that I see, is the way that I sort of reconcile Romans 4 and James chapter 2. Do you have any further thoughts on that? I'd love to hear your opinion on it.
Well, I mean, I think that we have plenty of examples, like in Hebrews 11, of, you know, people doing like Abraham built the ark, and by this he obtained, you know, the righteousness of faith. And and it's kind of the way that James seems to be asserting that it happened. Was he not justified by works when he offered his son? And I'm just thinking that might, you know, it would make it not too different. There would be no need to, I think, parse it out so independent. That's actually, you know, even now I know and all this stuff. But anyway, okay, just some thoughts. Just something didn't want to hold you up.
No, you're fine. Hey, I appreciate it. It was good to hear from you. I was wondering who you were whenever you would join this morning, and so I'm glad that I was able to attach a name to the voice. And it looks like
good to be here.
Looks like Elena is here as well. Yeah. So
Daniel.
Yes, ma'am.
No, looking at this, it's not that God that Abraham would offer up Isaac, but I think it had to be where it would be seen and it be known that Abraham had a lot of faith in God. It didn't matter what God would have told him to do. It just showed that Abraham had a faith that he had all the dependence in God, no matter what was the circumstances. Just that he had that much faith in the Father that whatever God told him to do, that's what he was going to do. Although that was Isaac was his only son, offer him up because he had a son.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, this is the ultimate expression of Abraham's faith, and you know, I often wonder, you know, would I have the faith to do something quite like that? Now, one thing that is interesting is that the Hebrew in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 2, where he says, "Take your son." So the Hebrew scholars say that that expression "take now your son" is actually, while it is an imperative, it's a softened version of the imperative, indicating that Abraham did have freedom of choice. This was not necessarily a command to Abraham, but it was a request to Abraham, and it was dependent upon Abraham's response to that request that he would either further receive these blessings mentioned in verse 15 and following, or what have you. But so I wanted to add that. I meant to say that earlier when we were in that passage, but it slipped my mind until I was looking over some of my notes here. Lena's here, by the way, everybody. I think she joined and then she left and then she joined back, but I think she's here now. So.
Hello.
Okay, so in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 9, he takes Isaac, he binds him on the altar, lays him on top of the wood. All right, and then in verse 10 we read that Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, here's one more time, "Hanini," which is that same expression that we read 2 other times so far in the passage. And he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And so this is again, we see the point of this. It wasn't that God did not know before, but there's a difference between righteousness in potential versus righteousness realized. So in Genesis 15, whenever Abraham had righteous imputed on base of his faith, that's one part of it. But again, there's a difference in being one that could potentially do the right thing, and then being one that actually follow God, even in a difficult situation. And so this is what we have fulfilled here in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12. That's what James means when he says that that saying was fulfilled. Now we have Abraham's actions to back up the proclamation of faith in the previous chapters. Here's one other thing we didn't really go over, but I'd like to point out real quick, is that in Genesis chapter 22, we have a little bit different version of Abraham than you do earlier in Genesis. Do you remember whenever Sodom and Gomorrah were going to be destroyed? What did Abraham do?
He went and got or something like that.
Yeah, he bargained with God, right? If let's say there's so many righteous people there, but here, when confronted with the potential death of his son, Abraham just totally resigns. He totally gives in and is going to do it. He doesn't plea or beg or anything. So it's sort of just an interesting difference between Abraham a few passages before and Abraham now, and I think that is a sign of character development. His faith is so mighty at this point in his life that he has no need to question God's motives or to bargain with God or anything like that, as he did earlier in his life. Let's see. Let's look at Genesis 22 and verse 12. Do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And that kind of is echoed in John 3:16, which says that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, right? His only begotten son. So that echoes Genesis 22:12. You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And then in verse 13 we read that Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Now, here is a interesting principle that's introduced in the Bible. This is the first example, at least that I can find, of something that resembles substitution sacrifice. We can argue about whether or not it exists in Genesis 3 or exists in Genesis 4 or in Genesis 9, but this is the first example of it being expressly mentioned. However, this is not the same type of substitutionary sacrifice that people talk about when they consider the cross, because this is not a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. This is a sacrifice as a sacrifice of thanks, or a sacrifice of gratefulness for providing Abraham with a son. As I mentioned before, human sacrifice was often related to the gods of fertility in the ancient Near East, and so this would be that type of sacrifice. And so this isn't exactly a vicarious, substitutionary sacrifice like we're familiar with in the New Testament, or at least we're familiar with debating in the New Testament, but it is a situation where something is offered in place of something else. Instead of offering up his son, he offers up the burnt offering. And that's going to be a significant development, especially when we get to the Passover, when we study the Passover in the book of Exodus, which I think actually that's what we're going to study next week. If you do want to put that on the bulletin, we're going to study the Passover sacrifice or the Passover offering in Exodus, there with the 10th plague. So this is one of the first, if not the first, example of a substitution sacrifice that we read about in the Bible. Now, in verse 14, we read that Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it will be provided." Now, notice the reference there to the mount of the Lord. This is another reason why some people believe that the location of the offering of Isaac was either the Temple Mount, as we read from First Chronicles, or was it Second Chronicles? Regardless, Second Chronicles 3:1, or possibly even the hill upon which Jesus was crucified. There's some traditions that say that as well. So this reference to the land of Moriah has caused a lot of people to theorize that maybe Isaac was offered in the same spot that Jesus would be offered, 1,500 years later. So there's just something interesting to think about. Again, I don't think we can prove that one way or the other, but it is an interesting idea. And the fact that he calls it the Mount of the Lord, is another evidence that some people cite in support of that claim. Now, in verse 15, because of Abraham's offering up Isaac, we have a reiteration of the promise made in chapters before. We read in verse 16, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son." There's that expression again. "Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." And so that's, fairly straightforward, but notice in verse 18 that in his seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed, or all the families or tribes of the earth will be blessed, as is mentioned elsewhere. And this again shows us the worldwide implications of the death of Christ. Jesus, in my opinion, did not just die for one nation or one tribe or one specific group, but Jesus' sacrifice was offered on behalf of all, and that is to offer the potential of blessings to everyone. No one is left out of that. If it's whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And so that's what I see in Genesis 22:18 is the potential universality of the offering up of Isaac. Yes.
One question, just that I can understand why he said, "No." Well, I'm asking why is it he's mentioning in verse 16 that I have done this thing and have not withheld thy son, thy only son.
Right.
There was another son, Ishmael, but he said this, thy only son. Is it because of the promise he gave to him that he was going to have a son?
Yes, and Ishmael, though he was Abraham's, descendant, this is not. As Galatians chapter 4 says, Ishmael was not the child of promise. He was a child of the bondwoman of the flesh, and so Isaac is considered the son of his inheritance, and that's what he's specifically talking about is, the one through whom these blessings would be fulfilled. So yeah, you're right. It has to do with the promise. Anybody else have anything? All right. Next week we're going to get into the Passover account on the 10th plague in the book of Exodus. So if you'd like to read over that, you can. And we're going to get into this idea as well, so at least lay the foundation of this idea of the firstborn in the in Jewish worship, and that's going to be important when we come to the New Testament eventually and start talking about why Jesus died and what his death does and how his death works, to put it crudely. So paying attention to the Passover is going to be very important when it comes to evaluating and trying to understand the death of Jesus. So if nobody else has anything, I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream here.